The Western Philosophy by Durant. Chapter 11 American Philosophers Santayana, James, and Durant. Section 4 Santayana, Reason in Religion. Santayana remarked of his countrymen that they would continue to the Catholics long after they have ceased to be Christians. This is the analysis of Renan and Anatole France, and of Santayana too. He loves Catholicism as one may still long for the woman who has deceived him. I do believe her, though I know she lies. He mourns for his lost faith, that splendid error which conforms better to the impulses of the soul than life itself. He describes himself at Oxford in the midst of some ancient ritual. Exile that I am, exile not only from the wind swept moor, where Guadarrama lifts his purple crest, but from the spirit's realm, celestial, sure, goal of all hope and the vision of the best. It is because of this secret love, this belief and unbelief, that Santayana achieves his masterpiece in reason, in religion, filling his skeptical pages with a tender sadness and finding in the beauty of Catholicism plentiful cause for loving it still. He smiles, it is true, at the traditional orthodoxy, the belief, namely, that the universe exists and is good for the sake of man or of the human spirit, but he scorns the enlightenment common to young wits and the worm-eaten old satirists who plume themselves on detecting the scientific inaptitude of religion, something which the blindest half see, but leave unexplored the habits of thought from which those tenets sprang, their original meaning and their true function. Here, after all, is a remarkable phenomenon that men everywhere have had religions. How can we understand men if we do not understand religions? Such studies would bring the skeptic face to face with the mystery and pathos of mortal existence. They would make him understand why religion is so profoundly moving and, in a sense, so profoundly just. Santayana thinks with Lucretius that it was fear which first made the gods. Faith in the supernatural is a desperate wager made by man at the lowest ebb of his fortunes. It is as far as possible from being the source of that normal vitality which subsequently, if his fortunes mend, he may gradually recover. If all went well, we should attribute it only to ourselves. The first things which a man learns to distinguish and repeat are things with a will of their own, things which resist his causal demands. And so the first sentiment with which he confronts reality is a certain animosity, which becomes cruelty toward the weak, and the fear and the fawning before the powerful. It is pathetic to observe how lowly are the motives that religion, even the highest, attributes to the deity, and from what a hard pressed and bitter existence they have been drawn. To be given the best morsel, to be remembered, to be praised, to be obeyed blindly and punctiliously. These have been thought points of honor with the gods, for which they would dispense favors and punishment on the most exorbitant scale. Add to fear, imagination. Man is an incorrigible animist and interprets all things anthropomorphically. He personifies and dramatizes nature and fills it with a cloud of deities. The rainbow is taken for a trace left in the sky by the passage of some beautiful and elusive goddess. Not that people quite literally believe this splendid mythos, but the poetry of them helps men to bear the prose of life. This mythopoeic tendency is weak today, and the science has led to a violent and suspicious reaction against imagination. But in primitive peoples, and particularly in the Near East, it was unchecked. The Old Testament abounds in poetry and metaphor. The Jews who composed it did not take their own figures literally. But when European peoples, more literal and less imaginative, mistook these poems for science, our Occidental theology was born. Christianity was at first a combination of Greek theology with Jewish morality. It was an unstable combination in which one or the other element would eventually yield. In Catholicism, the Greek and the pagan element triumphed. In Protestantism, the stern Hebraic moral code. The one had a Renaissance, the other a Reformation. The Germans, the northern barbarians, Santayana calls them, had never really accepted Roman Christianity, a non-Christian ethics of valor and honor, a non-Christian fund of superstitions, legend, and sentiment subsisted always among medieval peoples. The Gothic cathedrals were barbaric, not Roman. The warlike temper of the Teutonic raised its head above the peacefulness of the Oriental and changed Christianity from a religion of brotherly love to a stern inculcation of business virtues, from a religion of poverty to a religion of prosperity and power. It was this youthful religion, profound, barbaric, poetical, that the Teutonic races insinuated into Christianity and substituted for that last sign of two expiring worlds. Nothing would be so beautiful as Christianity, Santayana thinks, if it were not taken literally. But the Germans insisted on taking it literally. The dissolution of Christian orthodoxy in Germany was thereafter inevitable. For taken literally, nothing could be so absurd as some of the ancient dogmas, like the damnation of innocence, or the existence of evil in a world created by omnipotent benevolence. The principle of individual interpretation led naturally to a wild growth of sects among the people and to a mild pantheism among the elite. Pantheism being nothing more than naturalism poetically expressed. Lessing and Goethe, Carlyle and Emerson were the landmarks of this change. In brief, the moral system of Jesus had destroyed that militaristic Yahweh who, by an impish accident of history, had been transmitted to Christianity along with the pacifism of the prophets and of Christ. Santayana is, by constitution and heredity, incapable of sympathy with Protestantism. He prefers the color and the incense of his youthful faith. He scolds the Protestants for abandoning the pretty legend of medievaldom, and above all for neglecting the Virgin Mary, whom he considers as highly dead, the fairest flower of poesy. As a wit has put it, Santayana believes that there is no God and that Mary is his mother. He adorns his room with pictures of the Virgin and the saints. He likes the beauty of Catholicism, more than the truth of any other faith for the same reason that he prefers art to industry. There are two stages in the criticism of myths. The first treats them angrily as superstition. The second treats them smilingly as poetry. Religion is human experience, interpreted by human imagination. The idea that religion contains literal, not a symbolic, representation of truth and life is simply an impossible idea. Whoever entertains it has not come within the region of profitable philosophizing on that subject. Matters of religion should never be matters of controversy. We seek rather to honor the piety and understand the poetry embodied in these fables. The man of culture then will leave undisturbed the myths that so comfort and inspire the life of the people. And perhaps he will a little envy them their hope, but he will have no faith in another life. The fact of having been born is a bad augury for immortality. The only immortality that will interest him is that which Spinoza describes. He who lives in the ideal, says Santayana, and leaves it expressed in society or in art, enjoys a double immortality. The eternal has absorbed him while he lived, and when he is dead, his influence brings others to the same absorption, making them, through that ideal identity with the best in him, reincarnations and the perennial seeds of all in him, which he could rationally hope to rescue from destruction. He can say without any subterfuge or desire to delude himself that he shall not wholly die, for he will have a better notion than the vulgar of what constitutes his being by becoming the spectator and the confessor of his own death and of universal mutation. He will have identified himself with what is spiritual in all spirits and masterful in all apprehension, and so conceiving himself, he may truly feel and know that he is eternal. Section 5. Reason in Society. The great problem of philosophy is to devise a means whereby men may be persuaded to virtue without the stimulus of supernatural hopes and fears. Theoretically, it solved this problem twice. Both in Socrates and in Spinoza, it gave the world a sufficiently perfect system of natural or rational ethics. If man could be molded to either philosophy, all would be well. But a truly rational morality or social regimen has never existed in the world and is hardly to be looked for. It remains the luxury of philosophers. A philosopher has a haven in himself, of which I suspect the fabled bliss to follow in other lives is only a poetic symbol. He has pleasure in truth and an equal readiness to enjoy the scene or quit it. Though one may observe a certain obstinate longevity in him, for the rest of us, the avenue of moral development must lie in the future as in the past, in the growth of those social emotions which bloom in the generous atmosphere of love and the home. It is true, as Schopenhauer argued, that love is a deception practiced upon the individual by the race, that 9/10 of the cause of love are in the lover, for 1/10 that may be in the object, and that love fuses the soul again into the impersonal blind flux. Nevertheless, love has its recompenses, and in his greatest sacrifice, man finds his happiest fulfillment. Laplace is reported to have said on his deathbed that science was mere trifling, and that nothing was real but love. After all, romantic love, despite its poetical delusions, ends normally in a relationship of parent and child, far from satisfying to the instincts that any celibate security. Children are our immortality, and we commit the blotted manuscript of our lives more willingly to the flames when we find the immortal text half engrossed in a fairer copy. The family is the avenue of human perpetuity, and therefore still the basic institution among men. It could carry on the race even if all other institutions failed, but it can conduct civilization only to a certain simple pitch. Further development demands a larger and more complex system in which the family ceases to be the productive unit, loses its control over the economic relations of its members, and finds its authority and its powers more and more appropriated by the state. The state may be a monster, as Nietzsche calls it, a monster of unnecessary size, but its centralized tyranny has the virtue of abolishing the miscellaneous and innumerable petty tyrannies by which life was of old pestered and confined. One master pirate accepting tribute quietly is better than 100 pirates taking toll without warning and without stint. Hence, in part, the patriotism of the people, they know that the price they pay for government is cheaper than the cost of chaos. Santayana wonders whether such patriotism does more harm than good, for it tends to attach the stigma of disloyalty to the advocates of change. To love one's country unless that love is quite blind and lazy must involve a distinction between the country's actual condition and its inherent ideal. And this distinction, in turn, involves a demand for changes and for effort. On the other hand, race patriotism is indispensable. Some races are obviously superior to others. A more thorough adjustment to the conditions of existence has given their spirit victory, scope, and a relative stability. Hence, intermarriage is perilous except between races of acknowledged equality and stability. The Jews, the Greeks, the Romans, the English were never so great as when they confronted other nations, reacting against them and at the same time perhaps adopting their culture, but this greatness fails inwardly whenever contact leads to amalgamation. The great evil of the state is its tendency to become an engine of war, a hostile fist shaken in the face of a supposedly inferior world. Santayana thinks that no people has ever won a war where parties and governments are bad, as they are in most ages and countries. It makes practically no difference to a community apart from local ravages whether its own army or the enemy is victorious in war. The private citizen in any event continues in such countries to pay a maximum of taxes and to suffer in all his private interests a maximum of vexation and neglect. Nevertheless, the oppressed subject will glow like the rest with patriotic ardor, and will decry as dead to duty and honor anyone who points out how perverse is this helpless allegiance to a government representing no public interest. This is strong language for a philosopher, but let us have our Santayana unexpurgated. Often enough, he thinks conquest and absorption by a larger state is a step forward toward the organization and pacification of mankind. It would be a boon to all the world if all the world were ruled by some great power or group of powers, as all the world was once ruled by Rome, first with the sword and then with the word. The universal order once dreamed of and nominally almost established the empire of universal peace, or permeate, permeating rational art and philosophical worship is mentioned no more. Those dark ages from which our political practice is derived had a political theory we should do well to study, for their theory about a universal empire and a Catholic Church was in turn the echo of a former age of reason, when a few men conscious of ruling the world had for a moment sought to survey it as a whole and it rule it justly. Perhaps the development of international sports may give some outlet to the spirit of group rivalry and serve in some measure as moral equivalent for war, and perhaps the cross investments of finance may overcome the tendency of trade to come to blows for the market of the world. Santayana is not so enamored of industry as uh, Spencer was. He knows its militant as well as its pacific side, and all in all, he feels more at ease in the atmosphere of an ancient aristocracy than in the hum of a modern metropolis. We produce too much and are swamped with the things we make. Things are in the saddle and rid mankind, as Emerson put it. In a world composed entirely of philosophers, an hour or two a day of manual labor, a very welcome quality, would provide for material wants. England is wiser than the United States, for though she too is obsessed with the mania for production, she has in at least a portion of her people realized the value and the arts of leisure. He thinks that such culture as the world has always been the fruit of aristocracies. Civilization has hitherto consisted in the diffusion and the dilution habits arising in privileged centers. It has not sprang from the people, has arisen in their midst by a variation from them, and it has afterward imposed itself on them from above, a state composed exclusively such workers and peasants as make up the bulk of modern nations would be an utterly barbarous state. Every liberal tradition would perish in it, and the rational and the historic essence of patriotism itself would be lost. The emotion of it, no doubt, would endure, for it is not generosity that the people lack. They possess every impulse. It is experience that they cannot gather, for in gathering it, they would be constituting those higher organs that make up an aristocratic society. He dislikes the idea of equality and argues with Plato that the equality of unequals is inequality. Nevertheless, he does not quite sell himself to aristocracy. He knows that history has tried it and found its virtues very well balanced by its defects, that it closes career, unpedigreed talent, that it chokes the growth in all but a narrow line of just those superiorities and values that aristocracy would, in theory, develop and use. It makes for culture, but also it makes for tyranny. The slavery of millions pays for the liberty of a few. The first principle of politics should be that a society is to be judged by the measure of which it enhances the life and capacities of its constituent individuals. But for the excellence of the typical single life, no nation deserves to be remembered more than the sands of the sea. From this point of view, democracy is a great improvement on aristocracy, but it too has its evils. Not merely its corruption and its incompetence, but worse, its own peculiar tyranny, the fetch of uniformity. There is no tyranny so hateful as a vulgar, anonymous tyranny. It is all permeating, all thwarting. It blasts every budding novelty and spark of genius with its omnipresent and fierce stupidity. When Santayana despises above all is the chaos and the indecent haste of modern life, he wonders was there not more happiness for man in the old aristocracy, uh, aristocratic doctrine that the good is not liberty but wisdom and contentment with one's natural restrictions. The classical traditions knew that only a few can win, but now that democracy has opened the great free for all, catch as catch can, wrestling match of less affair industrialism. Every soul is torn with climate, and no one knows content. Classes war against one another without restraint, and whoever is victorious in this struggle, for which liberalism cleared the field, will make an end of liberalism. This is the nemesis of revolution too, that in order to survive they must restore the tyranny which they destroyed. Revolutions are ambiguous things. Their success is generally proportionate to their power of adaptation and to the reabsorption within them of what they rebelled against. A thousand reforms have left the world as corrupt as ever, for each successful reform has founded new institution, and thus institution has bred its new and congenial abuses. What form of society then shall we strive for? Perhaps for none. There is not much difference among them, but if for any one in particular for democracy, this would be government by men of merit and honor. It would be an aristocracy, but not hereditary. Every man and woman would have an open road according to ability to the highest offices in the state. But the road would be closed to incompetence, no matter how richly furnished it might be with plebiscite. The only equality subsisting would be equality of opportunity. Under such a government, corruption would be at a minimum, and the science and the arts would flourish through discriminating encouragement. It would be just that synthesis of democracy and aristocracy which the world pines for in the midst of its political chaos today. Only the best would rule, but every man would have an equal chance to make himself worthy to be numbered among the best. It is, of course, Plato over again, the philosopher kings of the Republic appearing inevitably on the horizon of every far-seeing political philosophy. The longer we think about these matters, the more surely we return to Plato. We need no new philosophy. We need only the courage to live up to the oldest and the best. Section 6. Common. There is in all these pages something of the melancholy of a man separated from all that he loves and was accustomed to, a man directing a Spanish aristocrat exiled to middle class America. A secret sadness sometimes breaks forth that life is worth living, he says, is the most necessary of assumptions, and were it not assumed, the most impossible of conclusions. In the first volume of the Life of Reason, he talks of the plot and the meaning of human life and history as the subject of philosophy. In the last volume, he wonders, is there a meaning or a plot? He has unconsciously described his own tragedy. There is a tragedy in perfection because the universe in which perfection arises is itself imperfect. Like Shelley, Santayana has never felt at home on this middling planet. His keen aesthetic sense seems to have brought to him more suffering from the ugliness of things than delight in the scattered loveliness of the world. He becomes at times bitter and sarcastic. He has never caught the hearty, cleansing laughter of paganism, nor the genuine and forgiving humanity of Renan or Anatole France. He stands aloof and superior, and therefore alone. What is the part of wisdom, he asks, and answers, to dream with one eye open, to be detached from the world without being hostile to it, to welcome fugitive beauties and pity fugitive sufferings without forgetting for a moment how fugitive they are. But perhaps this constant memento mori in a knell to joy, to live, one must remember life more than death. One must embrace the immediate and actual thing as well as the distant and perfect hope. The goal of speculative thinking is none other than to live as much as maybe in the eternal and to absorb and be absorbed in the truth. But this is to take philosophy more seriously than even philosophy deserves to be taken. And a philosophy which withdraws one from life is as much airy, uh, awry as any celestial superstition in which the eye, wrapped in some vision of another world, loses the meat and wine of this one. Wisdom comes by disillusionment, says Santayana, but again, that is only the beginning of wisdom. As doubt is the beginning of philosophy, it is not also the end of fulfillment. The end is happiness, and philosophy is only a means. If we take it as an end, we become like the Hindu mystic whose life purpose is to concentrate upon his neighbor. Perhaps Santayana's conception of the universe as merely a material mechanism has something to do with this somber withdrawal into himself. Having taken life out of the world, he seeks for it in his own bosom. He protests that it is not so, and though we may not believe him, his too much protesting disarms us with its beauty. A theory is not an emotional thing. If music can be full of passion merely by giving form to a single sense, how much more beauty or terror may not a vision be pregnant with, which brings order and method into everything that we know. If we are in the habit of believing in special providences or of expecting to continue your romantic adventures in a second life, materialism will dash your hopes most unpleasantly, and you may think for a year or two that you have nothing left to live for. But the thorough materialist, one born to the faith in the not have plunged into it by an unexpected christening in cold water, will be like the superb Democritus, a laughing philosopher, his delight in a mechanism that can fall into so many marvelous and beautiful shapes, and can generate so many exciting passions, should be of the same intellectual quality as that which the visitor feels in a museum of natural history, where he views the myriad butterflies in their cases, the flamingos and the shellfish, the mammoths and the gorillas. Doubtless there were pens in that incalculable life, but they were soon over, and how splendid, meantime, was the pageant! How infinitely interesting the universal interplay, and how foolish and inevitable those absolute little passions. But perhaps the butterflies, if they could speak, would remind us that a museum, like a materialist philosophy, is only a showcase of lifeless things, that the reality of the world eludes these tragic preservations and resides again in the pens of passion, in the ever changing and never ending flow of life. Santayana says an observant friend had a natural preference for solitude. I remember leaning over the railing of an ocean liner anchored at Southampton and watching passengers from the English tender crowd up the gangplank to the steamer. One only stood apart at the edge of the tender, with calm and amused detachment observed the haste and struggle of his fellow passengers, and not till the deck had been cleared, followed himself. Who could it be but Santayana? A boy sat beside me, and we all felt the satisfaction of finding a character true to himself. After all, we must say just that, too. Of his philosophy, it is a veracious and fearless self expression. Here, a mature and subtle, though too somber soul has written itself down quietly in statuesque and classic prose. And though we may not like its minor key, its undertone of sweet regret for a vanished world, we see in it the finished expression of this dying and nascent age, in which men cannot be altogether wise and free because they have abandoned their old ideas and have not yet found the new ones that shall lure them nearer to perfection. Today's work is over.